Hello and welcome to Politics and Prose Bookstore. My name is Olivia Marquis. I'm a part of the event staff here at Politics and Prose, where we now host in-person and virtual events, along with partnered and supported events, trips, and classes. For a full list of everything confirmed, please go to our website, politics-prose.com. Before we get started today, I'd like to ask you to please silence your cell phones so as not to disrupt the event. While we've lifted the mask mandate here in the store, you are encouraged to wear a mask throughout the event, and we can provide one for you if you did not bring one. When we get to the time for opening the floor to your questions, we've placed a standing microphone at the end of the aisle to your right in front of that pillar. Please line up at this mic so that everyone can hear your question, as we want your question to be heard in our recording of the event. We are both audio and video recording and live streaming today's program so that you or anyone you know can soon find it at the Politics and Prose YouTube channel. Following the Q&A, we'll have a signing up here at this table. So if you've not already purchased the book, we have many copies behind our registers at the front of the store. We will ask you to line up starting there at the pillar where the standing microphone is, and we will come by to ask your name for personalization, so please have your books ready for us. Once the event is complete, we ask that you fold up your chairs and lean them against something sturdy to help us out a bit. So now, without further ado, tonight I'm very excited to welcome Alex Marr, celebrating the release of 70 x 7, a true story of murder and mercy, a work that weaves an unforgettable narrative of an act of violence and its aftermath. In the steel town of Gary, Indiana, in 1985, 15-year-old Paula Cooper, a young black girl, kills Ruth Pelke, an elderly white woman, in a violent home invasion. Against the backdrop of a city historically plagued by racial tensions and white flight, 10th grader Paula is sentenced to death, with no one decrying her impending execution. However, the tide begins to shift when the victim's grandson, Bill, forgives the girl, against the wishes of his family, and campaigns to spare her life. This tragedy gains international attention as newspapers cover the story on their front pages and millions sign petitions in support of Paula. As Paula waits on death row, her fate sparks a debate that not only animates legal circles, but also raises vital questions about the value of human life. What are we demanding when we call for justice? Is forgiveness an act of desperation or of profound bravery? As Bill and Paula's friendship deepens, and as Bill discovers others who have chosen to forgive after terrible violence, their story asks us to consider what radical acts of empathy we might be capable of. This is a story about the will to live, to survive, to grow, to change, and about what we are willing to accept as justice. Tirelessly researched and told with intimacy and precision, this book brings a haunting chapter in the history of our criminal justice system to astonishing life. Alex Marr is the author of Witches in America, which was a New York Times notable book of 2015. Her work has appeared in New York Magazine, Wired, the New York Times Book Review, and The Guardian, among many other outlets, as well as the Best American Magazine Writing. She was a finalist for the National Magazine Award in Feature Writing in 2018. She is also the director of the feature-length documentary, American Mystic. She lives in the Hudson Valley in New York City. Marr will be in conversation with Tope Folarin. Folarin is a Nigerian-American writer based in Washington, D.C. He serves as a director of the Institute for Policy Studies and the Lennon Visiting Lecturer in Creative Writing at Georgetown University. He is a recipient of the Caine Prize for African Writing, the Whiting Award for Fiction, and a fellowship from the National Endowment of the Arts, among other awards. Tope also serves as a board member of the Avalon Theater in Washington, D.C., and the vice president of the board of the Penn Faulkner Foundation, and as a member of the President's Council of Pathfinder. Please join me in welcoming to Politics and Prose, Alex Marr and Tope Folarin.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming out. And thanks so much for the great introduction. That was terrific. I feel like these introductions make us sound so busy. I just thought before we have our conversation, I was thinking of doing a little reading, read for 10, 12 minutes, something like that, to give you a sense of the scope of the book. One of the challenges, I think, when you have a story where at its center there is a violent crime, there's this question of, okay, when do you introduce the crime itself? because the pacing of that, the timing of that, does a lot to influence how open-minded the reader may be, how empathetic the reader may be towards the various parties involved, right? So rather than start the book with the crime in 1985, I decided to open it up a few years earlier in 1979 at a moment when Paula Cooper, who at 15 would commit this murder, is actually only 9 years old, and her older sister Rhonda is 12. This scene, I hope, gives everyone a little bit of a sense of what kind of a childhood she had and what kind of a girl she started to grow into, so that by the time she was 15, we have some sense of her actions and the reasoning behind them. So here we go. One house of the many that make up a city, a pale yellow house, an hour after sunup in Gary, Indiana. A woman lives here on Wisconsin Street with her 2 daughters. Rhonda is 12. Her sister Paula is 9. It is 1979. Their mother, her name is Gloria, hustles them outside into the morning light and then into the dark of the garage and the back seat of her red Chevy Vega. The girls are very young, and they are powerfully tired. They understand what their mother intends to do. She has kept them up all night, softly talking, then shouting, then whimpering to them about where they'll be traveling together, about what must happen next. And they are no longer resistant. With her daughters inside, Gloria tugs at the garage door until it slides down to meet the concrete. She slips into the driver's side, rolls down the windows, turns the key in the ignition. The engine gives off a deep, thrumming sound. Then she waits for them to close their eyes and fall into that steady rhythm. She can see their faces in the rearview mirror, small and brown and perfect. All 3 are still, their limbs grown heavy as if underwater. The engine continues running. The minutes accumulate. The air thickens. Outside the garage, the neighborhood is awakening. Inside the garage, the girls are passing into an unnatural sleep. What Rhonda remembers next, she and Paula laying side by side on their bottom bunk, not knowing how they got there. They have not exited the world. Gloria is leaning over them, her daughters. They will be all right, she says, just before leaving. Rhonda does not know how much time has passed before she is able to move her body. She rises slowly. A letter is taped to the door from their mother. She is finishing what she set out to do. Rhonda rushes to the kitchen and calls her aunt, who tells her to run, get their neighbor. Through the window, she thinks she sees exhaust seeping out from under the garage door into the bright daylight. Mr. Hollis drags Gloria out of the garage and lays her on her back on the lawn. He drops to his knees and, with elbows locked, hand over hand, pushes hard on her chest, again and again. The neighbor across the street, a nurse, rushes over and takes her turn trying to pump breath back into Gloria's body. The ambulance arrives, and the fire department, and a medic becomes the third person in line to tend to Gloria. By now, Paula is standing outside, watching. Rhonda sees her younger sister grow hysterical at the sight of this stranger bearing down on their mother's chest, and Gloria not responding. Something Rhonda will not forget. No one examines them, the girls. The firemen, the medics, no one so much as takes their pulse. When Gloria is swept off to the hospital, the sisters go stay with their aunt. When after a week, their mother checks herself out early, no one asks any questions. When she comes to retrieve her daughters, no one stops her. For years, Rhonda has said that she does not know what transformed her sister. But now she tells me, as if untangling the question out loud, that this was it. This must have been the start of a change in Paula. Because you have to understand, we were all supposed to have been dead. That's what we were expecting. That's what we were hoping. But they were still alive. And what now? Another day in the yellow house. So I'm just going to skip ahead now and just read one more passage. What happens after that is, you get to know some of the other characters. The crime takes place, and eventually Paula is sentenced to death, as you heard in the summary. I'm going to skip ahead to a bit where the victim, Ruth Pelkey's grandson, who's 39 years old, Bill, has a change of heart a few months after being in court and witnessing this teenage girl get the death sentence. In that moment, he thought it was the right thing. That was justice. The family agreed, the community agreed. The prosecutor sold this idea very hard. But on this particular night that I'm going to describe, he has a radical change in his view of that death sentence. I should say before we get to that bit that Bill is really just such a fantastic character to my mind, because he is someone who previously had no political kind of bone in his body. He was not an activist. He was not used to making public statements about anything, right? He worked as a crane operator in a steel mill for almost 2 decades. He, clocked in, went home, just went about his business. He loved the ladies. He knew how to kind of have a nice time in his free time. There was nothing about Bill that gave anyone a clue that he was about to become this sort of radical spokesperson for mercy in Lake County, Indiana. So I'm going to give you a sense here of his job at the steel mill, this one particular night where he shows up on the late shift and has this incredible change of heart. On this particular night, Bill has signed up for a 3 to 11 overtime shift, and he is asked to report instead to the roughing mill to 509, the crane he'd started on at 19 years old. Overtime is often the easiest. Sometimes you get 8 hours pay for only an hour's work, union rules, but he feels dried up. A few weeks earlier, he and Judy decided to part ways. She'd stayed with him through the hard months after his grandmother's death and accompanied him to court on that bitter day, the sentencing of the worst of the girls months ago now. But then they'd started fighting over anything, and it seemed to Bill that on nights when he wanted to stay home and be together, she wanted to go out and drink and stare at strangers. They both agreed they must not have enough in common somehow. The decision was mutual. But the breakup had brought him very, very low. Bill had stopped seeing friends or returning phone calls. He was so low that he'd started to pray again, maybe twice a day, something he hadn't done since his grandmother's death, or before that, his days at that Baptist college. When he is alone at home and not needed at the mill, he feels as if he is praying nonstop. He thinks of this as his anguishing prayer. He cannot put words to the heaviness. He does not understand the hurt he is experiencing. And so these prayers always begin the same way. Why? Sometimes that is the whole prayer. It comes from a place of such despondency, so deep inside he is afraid of it. Nothing remotely like this has emerged from him before, even when he was set on becoming a preacher. A few days ago, he'd been standing in his kitchen, and then he was crying. And then he was crying and hitting his head against the wall and praying out loud like that, hitting his head and calling out, "Why?" Maybe it was a kind of nervous breakdown. The job had made it a little easier to move through his days, one coil at a time with perfect focus. From up in the crane cab, the world below was mappable, delineated in chalk, and his role in that world required his full attention. But this shift is dead. Seated up high, parked over the roughing area, he stares and he waits. The guys have yet to call with instructions. He sits alone, looking down on the empty floor. The machinery is still. The space is strangely silent. And perhaps because the mill is private at this moment, he starts to pray. And now he feels it. His cheeks are wet. He is crying hard. Leaning back in the chair, Bill returns to his anguishing prayer, asking the same question over and over, like somebody dense, like a child. Why? What is the logic of his God if someone like him is still living while his grandmother took her final breaths pinned with a butcher knife to her dining room floor? It has been 18 months, 4 since the last of those girls was sentenced. He pictures her, Paula Cooper, sitting in her death row cell, probably no bigger than this crane cab, her back up against the wall. In this image, she is crying just as he is, and she is asking aloud, "What have I done?" But the girl is far more alone than he will ever be. Bill thinks of her sentencing, the only time he appeared in the courthouse. Seeing Paula Cooper in person, he was struck by how young she looked. Just turned 16, 23 years younger than him. She was a girl. And immediately after her sentence was read, that man, the girl's grandfather, the only grown family that had shown up, the way he had called out, the way he had lost it, and how a guard had escorted the old man down the aisle right past Bill, still calling out about his grandbaby, wretched. Paula was let out next, the front of her prison smock darkened with tears, head bobbing, her eyes darting from side to side as if looking for the person who might appear at any moment to help her. A single photo of Bill's grandmother was used in the press around her death. It is a close-up cropped from a church portrait of the Pelkey'S a few years back, taken against a velvety black backdrop. On the left are Bill's parents, Bob and Lola. Seated down in front are Bill and his sister Dottie. And on the right stand Oscar, his shoulders hunched with age, and Ruth. The men wear freshly laundered off-the-rack suit jackets and wide ties. The women are in pretty feminine blouses, their hair recently done. Move in closer, and here is the familiar image. Ruth Pelke, with a ring of soft, silvery white curls around her head, high cheekbones, a beatific half-smile. She wears pink lipstick, cat's eye glasses, and silver earrings the size of coat buttons. Her collarless blouse is a pale Marion blue, and on its lapel she has pinned a mother's crown brooch decorated with a rhinestone for each of her 9 grandchildren. Ruth looks serene, her chin at an angle that suggests she is pleased. Bill thinks of how beautiful she is in that photo. In the years leading up to his grandmother's death, he had rejected the rules he was raised with, and his parents had been ashamed. But his grandmother never turned away from him. She continued to include Bill in her prayers, even after he'd stopped calling himself a Baptist. She had wanted good things to come to him. At this moment, the image he holds in his mind begins to transform. His grandmother's eyes begin to shine. They are wet, and tears begin a steady, clear runoff down her cheeks. Her face remains still, frozen in that day in the portrait studio. But the photograph is weeping. Ruth Pelke has become like one of the weeping statues of the Virgin Mary, those figures discovered in so many countries leaking tears of blood or oil or scented water, receiving thousands of visitors desperate for a demonstration of truth. Or else her tears are in the likeness of the Son, of Jesus in Bethany crying over the death of Lazarus. Jesus wept. This, too, is a lamentation. The photograph is weeping because here is a woman in pain. Ruth hurts from the memory of her death, from the final 30 minutes of her life. But that's not it. No. It seems to Bill in this moment that Ruth's feelings are passed to him, that they flood his chest, and he believes he understands. She is crying for that girl, for Paula Cooper, for the girl's grandfather. She would not have wanted him to suffer the knowledge that his grandchild will be buckled into a chair and her body overwhelmed by electrical current. And she would not want this girl to be killed for killing her, to be killed in her name. Bill thinks of what Jesus said when the Romans raised him up on the cross. Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. For the first time, he believes it is possible that the girl did not know what she was doing when she killed Ruth, that she'd been out of her right mind, that a blind anger must have propelled her forward. And now, his grandmother is calling on him to forgive her. His grandmother is calling on him. Is this a calling? Almost 30 years since he first dreamt of such a moment, Bill Pelke is being called. At first, the revelation is a notion. It infuses no part of his body. It changes nothing about his instincts toward the girl. Those remain cool and hard. Bill has decided to forgive her, to have compassion, but he has none to give. And he knows that if he cannot find that store of empathy sunk deep inside of him, then from this point on, whenever he pictures his grandmother, he will feel that he failed her. Eventually, he will shut her image out. Bill begins again to pray, the way a desperate person forms words, unable to prevent them slipping from his lips. He prays for God to make him love Paula Cooper, to flood him with it. And he waits. He waits. And inevitably, this comes to him. If that girl is worth forgiving, if even his grandmother can feel compassion for her, can wish for her protection, then he must be too. Though he has also, in his own way, fucked things up beyond repair, Bill himself must be worth preserving. In the quiet of the mill, high above the dead machines, Bill considers what he will do. He will write Paula a letter. And in that letter, he will tell her about his grandmother and about God's forgiveness and how Jesus loves her just as he loves every person who ever walked the earth. And as he parses them out, the words he will write, Bill can see a way forward. He can imagine her just maybe writing back. And in his head, this becomes a real correspondence, and he truly wants to know what she might say to him, not by way of explanation for what she's done, but as proof of humanness, of consciousness in a concrete box on death row. And Bill realizes he does not want to see this girl die. There it is, compassion. This is enough to forgive. He has forgiven her already. He will tell the story of this night for the next 30 years. For some with whom he shares it, the story will recall a passage in the Gospel of John in which Jesus, upon learning of the death of one of his followers, begins to weep. And then he approaches the tomb and asks that it be opened, and he calls for the man to come out. Inside the tomb, the dead man sits up and then stands and then steps outside. His hands and feet are wrapped in linen. His face is covered. Jesus says to the crowd, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." To be released from the threat of the death house would make of Paula Cooper another kind of Lazarus. And she and Bill both, they would take off their grave clothes. Thanks.
Wow. It's a really compelling reading, and I think ties directly to what really, I was really moved by this book, which is your deep attention to the humanity of these people, regardless of who they are or what they've experienced in life. You keep on sort of focusing on their innate humanity and how important that is. So to begin, I'm wondering what why you wanted to write this story. Why was this an important story for you to spend so many years of your life thinking about and writing and researching?
That's the key question with any book, right?
Yeah, sure.
For me, I was doing some research into specifically at the time violent crimes committed by women, just because I don't know if any of you are aware, but it's quite rare for women to commit violent crimes. And so I wanted to see, okay, what are the patterns? I wanted to just find out a little bit about what we understand about that. So I was looking at a lot of case summaries. I stumbled across the story of Ruth Pelkey's murder completely by accident in that context. But what stopped me in my tracks and made me drop everything else was the fact of this young girl, Paula Cooper's age at the time of the crime, that she was 15 and had committed this heinous act, that she was sentenced to death in spite of being so young. And then beyond that, the fact that a few months later, her victim's grandson chose to publicly forgive Paula. I had never, at that point, heard of anything like that. I thought, that is something I cannot wrap my head around. And I was compelled to try to find a phone number for Bill Pelke, and I gave him a ring and just said, can
Just
we
out of the
talk
blue.
out of the blue? Would it be okay if I just asked you about that decision you made years ago? And by the time I got off the phone with him that day, I knew I was going to have to go a lot deeper into this story.
Wow. Something you also said at the beginning, which resonates with me in my experience of reading this book, is you talk about the importance of placing these events in context, right? About sort of talking about what preceded the act that is the focus of the book in some ways. Certainly what people may think about when they think about Paula Cooper, the fact that she murdered this old, defenseless woman. I want to read a little bit from your book and ask you to comment on it. You say, in the building of every city, decisions are made as to who gets what. A city's framework, the bones of it, laid down with intent. Some groups of residents are protected and served while others are left isolated and exposed. This is the tension underlying all American cities. And in Gary, where this happened, this tension was extreme from the start. I want to ask you why placing these events in context is important for you for this text.
Yeah, I really wanted to give a sense of, when there's any act of violence, any really startling crime, it doesn't happen in isolation. I think even today, we have this kind of tough on crime approach that's very popular, that wins elections. And it's based on the idea that if you take one individual and you incarcerate them, or in this case, you sentence her to death, then that threat and that problem is solved. But actually, leading up to this crime were a lot of pieces that had to fall into place. Gary is a city in Indiana that has this fascinating history. It had the first black mayor in America, one of the two first, like a robust black community, civil rights movement, just a really interesting...
Jackson 5.
Yeah, the Jackson 5. Let's not who do have two shout-outs in the book. But I wanted to give a sense of this neighborhood where Ruth Pelke lived. Glen Park had been very white and middle class forever. This is a city that was extremely segregated to the point that it was equivalent to parts of the Jim Crow South. And when there was white flight from Gary, a lot of the resources were bled from the city. So there was a lot of stress. There were people who were unemployed. There were there wasn't enough of a sense of, I call the first chapter the care of children, because truly no one was curious about what was going on in Paula Cooper's house, even though she was growing up in an abusive household, until she had committed this terrible crime. But for years before that, she and her sister were running away from home. They asked social workers for help. Paula took herself to the police station at one point and said, I've been beaten by my father. I don't want to go home, right? But the system continued to send her back. So it's just kind of, it was important to me that people think about the bigger picture, not just with this case, but then hopefully it just is about, like, when you get into that kind of mindset, you're open to seeing more of the variables that actually are part of the larger cause.
Sure. Another thing that struck me about this is that you seem to be arguing throughout, and tell me if I have this right, that a dispassionate analysis of the facts of a particular case maybe never fully suffices if you're trying to sort of determine what should happen to somebody who commits a crime, that at certain points, if not all the time, it's important to bring history and context into these cases. Do I have that right?
I mean, I think that's true in the sense that, it works in two ways. So what we have in the 80s, mitigating evidence wasn't as much of a force in the courtroom, and so mitigating evidence is, it's evidence that's brought to bear to justify a lesser sentence for the defendant. So in this case, it would have been abuse in the home, the mother's alcoholism, and so on, her age. That was not weighed heavily enough in Paula's case when she received the death sentence. The other side of it, though, is, I have examples in this of how when emotion is injected too much into the process, as with the death penalty, the reaction that the average person has to the topic of the death penalty is one of anger and emotion, right? There are so many people who have never had the death penalty touch their lives personally, but if you bring it up in, coffee conversation, they will have a passionate, often, not very deeply informed opinion about how the death sentence serves a purpose, right? And so there are some of the attorneys who are kind of like the secret superheroes of this book, fight the battle of trying to set precedent in the courts when we talk about sentencing teenagers to death, rather than using the emotions that are stirred up by a violent crime.
Yeah. Indeed. At another point in the book, I hope you forgive me for using your words in this. A lot of good stuff in it, obviously.
Use my words against me? Is that what we're going to do? Oh, boy.
No. You said, I've asked myself what our common definition of justice might be if there is even a shared understanding of that word. How can we arrive at a shared definition of justice from your perspective? Is that even possible in this, especially in this really fraught political environment? People are at loggerheads over any number of issues. Is it possible to achieve, to kind of arrive at a common sense of justice in this moment?
I mean, I know that that is an enormous and unfair question.
No, I mean, it is an enormous, but it's an opportunity for you to take that wherever you want.
Yes.
Yeah.
What I would say about the topic of justice is I think we'd already be ahead of the game if more people were willing to just accept that the answer to that question is complex and it's layered. It is not black and white. There is so much gray. And so I think that, to go back to the tough on crime phrase, that slogan, it's based on a fantasy that we can elect officials who are going to come in and they are going to solve our problems. Like, they're going to come into your community and suddenly everyone's going to be safe within a 4-year term or what have you, right? Yeah. So this is a fantasy, and I think we need to look more closely at what is truly making our communities safer. And in a case like this, you have a young girl. Well, what if there had been more resources for her in terms of her mental health, a safe home for her to be moved into, any number of things? Would Paula have ended up committing this crime, right? And so safety has to do with often the well-being of a lot of our neighbors, So the last thing I'll say about this is, in working on this story, it was really the first time in my life that I've thought so much about how there is a family on either side of any crime. In any courtroom, there's a family on either side. And we have a system that operates in such a way that those two families are designed to be kept apart. Reaching across the aisle just would throw a wrench into the works. It doesn't serve the prosecutor's agenda. We just don't have a system that can sustain that. So when Bill reached out to Paula and her sister, you know, to me, I started talking to the different parties involved, and I saw, you know, wow, that you can apply that approach to so many things in our lives and in our system, and hopefully get a little closer to a just result.
I mean, they had a correspondence, right? They were writing to each other because they couldn't.
Yeah, so one of the really incredible things about this book is I had, in the research, I had access to hundreds and hundreds of letters between Paula and Bill Pelke. It started out, like in the passage that I read, where he just decides, okay, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to write one letter to this girl on death row who killed my grandmother. And let's see what happens. And Paula responds eventually, and she's angry. She is pissed off. She's overwhelmed. All she can think of is that this guy and his family have sentenced her to death. She is not open to a dialogue necessarily, but he keeps coming back. And eventually it just is apparent to both of them that something genuine is happening. I mean, they start sending each other jokes. They give each other personal life advice. Paula, a teenage girl on death row, actually gives personal life advice at various points to Bill, who's a middle-aged man, you know, with whom she has almost nothing in common. It's a real relationship, and she starts to understand that he is genuine in his desire to try to help her in whatever way he can, which is it was so striking to me to explore that.
Yeah. It's a really good point. The other thing that I was, you know, that as I was reading this, kind of, I was surprised with was the kind of international response to this. Like, there's a really, that part of the reason I think people began to respond to Paula differently is because people abroad were saying, hey, what's going on in America? What are you guys doing over there? I mean, at one point the Pope even sort of says, hey, he sends, I think, a representative to kind of see what's going on and to kind of appeal for her life, right?
Yeah, there's something there. So this story actually goes from, you know, the steel mills of Indiana all the way to the Vatican, which to me was incredible. It really blew my mind once I understood the scope of the story. Essentially what happened is this girl's sentenced to death in Lake County, Indiana, and it was all over the papers, but because of the sensational nature of the crime itself, people were not shocked. The coverage was not, you know, this overwhelming coverage because we had just sentenced a teenage girl to death. It was because of the crime. And it wasn't until the European press picked up on this. So there were two Italian journalists who I mentioned in the book who become characters, and they were based in New York at the time, but were writing for papers in Rome and in Florence. And one of them sees a little item in USA Today, you know, just like one of those little items they used to have on maybe page 3, you know, teenage 15-year-old girl sentenced to death in Indiana, and she just thinks, you know, this can't be right. That's just can't possibly be something that just happened in America. And she did a little research, and she convinced her Italian editor to fly her to Gary with this other reporter, and these two Italian papers were the first foreign press to do original reporting on the ground in Indiana. And the whole scope of their story, the thrust of their stories that were teased on the front pages in Europe was, how is this possible? Yeah. They just sentenced a kid to death in America, and she's a girl, which of course was this added shock factor for a lot of people. And that then was picked up in the American media. So the story bounced back into the US with a different angle. And suddenly in the American press, especially in the Midwest, people were asking big questions on the front page. You know, should we have done this? You know, maybe we need to look more closely at this case. And it set a lot of events into motion. You know, Bill Pelkey's decision to forgive her had also been covered by the Italians, so that was picked up as well. So he's suddenly making statements on the front pages of Indiana papers. So it, you know, and then as you mentioned, eventually, through a series of dramatic events, even Pope John Paul II ends up getting involved, which it was, you know, it was really fun to write the Pope as a character.
I can only imagine. I'll ask you one more question before throwing it to the audience for questions. I'm asking this as one writer to another writer. I wonder what you want this book to do in the world. What's your ambition for this? Is this about increasing the level of empathy we have, or is this about learning more about the power of forgiveness, or what do you think about when you think about some person you don't know curled up with this book at 2 a.m. in the morning? What do you want this book to do in the world?
My hope is that, you know, I wrote this story because I was so compelled by the characters, so-called, involved. You know, real people, but characters in the story. And I hope that people will be open to reading about them, almost like they would, you know, in a great novel. These compelling and totally unique relationships between, for instance, Bill and Paula, between Paula and her sister Rhonda, between Bill and Rhonda, between Paula and these emissaries from the Vatican. But more than that, I think for me, it moves me because it's about the surprising possibility of connection. You know, connection between people as human beings in even the most extreme circumstances. And part of that came through this decision to forgive, but it's also the bravery of reaching out when it seems like the other person must be your enemy. And then ultimately finding out that, you know what, they're not. We have some kind of human connection. And, you know, that sense of, that feeling's at the heart of this story, and it really carried me through the 5 years of working on this book.
Yeah, beautifully said. So any questions or comments? We have a microphone right here. I sense question. Yeah, there we go.
Thank you for your talk. Hi, Tope.
Good to see you. Good to see you.
You spent a lot of time talking about Bill Pelkey's transformation this evening away from favoring Paula's death to being opposed to it, and I know historically that he went on to have a long career in that space as a crusader against the death penalty. But I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the transformation that Paula underwent as a person and the growth that she experienced as a maturing and reflective adult. I also know what happened to her, but I won't go into that. I just wonder if you can just talk about her own evolution as a compassionate person.
Sure. One thing that I found to be so exceptional about Paula was that she entered the system at 15 when she was first arrested. She was on death row by 16. She ended up spending a long time in prison. And for that first period of time, she was, by all accounts, a very difficult resident of both facilities she was at because she was young, you know. At the same time, there was this other piece of the picture, which was that she was determined to become something more. She had ultimately hundreds of pen pals all over the world, and for years at a time, she would sit in her cell and write letters every single day, right? And sometimes it was to Bill, and the maturity it took to write and have a relationship with the relative of your victim is pretty major. But you know, at one point it got to the point where she was confident enough to write a letter on her own behalf to the Pope. You know, and I got to see her voice evolve and mature through her writing. Years later, she finally had a bigger shift in her behavior and her attitude. She got her GED. She got a college degree. She was excelling at a number of programs they had in the prison. But beyond that, she developed this reputation for actually helping out the other women in the facility. Whenever a woman would show up and have no one that she knew and wasn't getting any visitors, she would throw a birthday party for them, or she would get somebody a pair of shoes she knew didn't have anything. You know, she started looking outside of herself instead of the very teenage, traumatized turmoil that you can see expressed in her early letters and in her early life. So, and you know, there's more to her story beyond that, but I'll let you read the rest of the story in the book.
Hi. My name's Kathy Riley, and I grew up in Lake County, Indiana, right around Gary. So I kind of intimately knew this story. I had left by 1985. But what I felt reading the book is that it was a gift to Paula. That Paula, you know, she had to live her life as this 15-year-old that was sentenced, and her whole life was controlled by that one moment. And a lot of the forgiveness and a lot of what's in the book is that no one is all of who they are in one moment, in that one moment. And her mother was awful. You know, her mother, I mean, I realize it's all in the news, but I feel like people don't want to spoil the end of the book, but I feel like you gave a gift to Paula. And people who read the book will see her as much larger than the newspapers. And the other thing I wanted to say was, in my connection with the book is having known the district attorney or the prosecutor that made the sentence. And in your interview with him at the end, when you asked him, would you do it again? Would you recommend the death penalty as strongly as you did? And he still didn't know. In his 70s, after all of this time and everything, and that for him, the tension between being a politician and reflecting what you think will either get you to win or what your constituents want you to do, and some sense of your own moral compass and your truth, I felt like that gets at some of what we're struggling with all the time in our democracy, of people trying to, you know, not take the leadership position, but actually reflect sometimes our lowest, greediest, most horrible selves. So I guess, you know, those are two statements, and the quick question is, there's so many different characters, and some of them did find compassion and empathy and forgiveness, and others didn't at all. And it doesn't seem like something that comes from people's schooling. You know, we see, and I could see that in my own. I went to the same high school as he did. And so did Judge Carrillo, the man that came up against Trump. They all went to Bishop Knoll High School. So it's not schooling. It's not religion. Like, what would you say, if you have any thoughts, having talked to all these people, allows people to touch that sense of empathy and understanding and forgiveness?
Oh, well, thank you for your comments, Kathy. I
highly recommend the book.
Thank you. I mean, so what Kathy was just referring to is, you know, the prosecutor in Lake County, who was the prosecutor for like about more than 10 years, he also becomes a character in the book of some depth. And I don't have any answer personally about what makes us more or less compassionate. I also, you know, to be fair, I made an effort to show people in the book who were struggling with that response, and, you know, who needed time to be angry and felt that a harsher sentence was appropriate. One of the larger questions running through the book and through also a lot of the work that I do is, you know, when you find yourself in an extreme situation, what ends up being your guiding principle? Is it the faith you were raised with? Is it the faith you found? Is it the letter of the law? Is it something your mom used to say that just has always seemed like the truth to you? You know, what do you fall back on? And, you know, someone like Jack Crawford, the prosecutor, he was raised Catholic. During his time as prosecutor, because of the violence he witnessed, he kind of lost his faith. And he also was more concerned with politics and with getting elected, and he embraced that. And he saw that the death penalty was something that was, you know, it was an effective way to come off as tough on crime. And he played that hand. And but then you have someone like Bill who went against the wishes of his family, his friends, the members of his congregation, his coworkers, I mean, everybody, and said, I think we should give this girl an easier time. And that made him a radical and an outsider for a long time. So, the book just asks a lot of questions about, how would you end up responding? How would I end up responding in that situation? What informs that? So, a lot of layers, and I don't have one answer.
I guess I wanted to, what struck me as Kathy told me about the book, and I was involved as a person against the death penalty for a long time, that I could parallel the career of Jack Crawford with another person educated at Catholic institutions, my classmate who was governor of Arkansas at around the same time, and who then lost governorship in his second time. But then, in his third try, he changed his views on the death penalty. And during his campaign, he went back to Arkansas and presided over the execution of a man who was mentally incompetent, Ricky Rector. And that man became president of the United States. And so that we see Jack Crawford kind of burned out. He didn't achieve any higher elective office than Lake County prosecutor. But someone else grabbing onto the same brass ring of politics and the death penalty really did go very far. And so when I read this story, think about this story or other stories, is how much we need to get politics out of criminal justice issues, would be the way I would say it. And I wondered if you had any thoughts about that. Along with all the morality and having people change, is there a way that you could see, because we have pretty much now, Joe Biden is against the death penalty, and that's not an issue, but certainly there's lots of issues that have to do with criminal justice.
I think possibly something that contributes to what you're talking about is sort of taking the politics out of certain criminal justice issues, is, as was alluded to before, another piece of the book is that when Paula is taken off death row, Bill Pelke is still really energized. He has this voice now and he wants to do something with it. So he starts taking part in rallies and marches against the death penalty. He's never met an activist in his life. He's in his pressed gray suit, carrying a Bible, showing up at the march, surrounded by hippies and ACLU college volunteers and stuff. Exactly. And okay, it took a certain amount of bravery. He was a fish out of water. And he ends up meeting one by one over time other people who are murder victims, family members, who did not want to go for the death penalty in their cases. And I think the power of that, as they start to figure out collectively as a group, is that it personalizes the issue. It makes it hard to talk about politics when a murder victim's family member is standing next to you saying, wait a second, but I don't want what the prosecutor wants. So that complicates the story, doesn't it? Right? And it effectively changes the conversation in that moment.
Yeah. Any more questions? Comments?
Why 70 times 7? Oh, that's a good question. I love this title because to some people it will be mysterious and others will get the reference. But this is, it's a reference to the book of Matthew. So it's a moment in the Bible that means a lot to Bill Pelke, as you find out in the story, in which the disciple Peter says, I'm going to get this right. It's at the top of the book. Peter says to Jesus, Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Up to 7 times? He's pushing back. He's pushing back at Jesus in that moment. Jesus answered, I tell you, not 7 times, but 70 times 7. And I love that because it's this challenge to forgive almost an infinite number of times. But I don't think it's fair. I think that's a really tough ask for anyone. And what Bill did is a tough ask for anyone. So to me, that's kind of that's what we're wrestling with at the center of the book.
I brought to mind too, I mean, I don't know why I thought about this, but when I was reading, I also thought about like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission process in South Africa, when you had a number of people who had suffered and their relatives had been killed during the apartheid regime. And they also had this moment where they could express their forgiveness to the perpetrators of those crimes. I think part of the argument, I hope you don't mind if I say this, is that in order to surmount so many of our challenges, that we have to be willing and sort of search within to find the ability to forgive people, even for the most heinous and difficult things that may have happened, right? And to your point, it's a really big ask, but maybe I think part of what you're saying is that that's something that we might have to do in order to achieve some kind of healing, right?
Well, because you're referring to how post-apartheid there was, I mean, what else are you going to do, right? Aside from having just an endless civil war. And I think it's clearly, these questions are clearly connected to where we're at right now in this country, right? So there have been plenty of times where I've not wanted to talk with people who differ from me in their political views because we've become so polarized. And then I wonder, but then what's the way forward, right? So, but the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is I definitely thought about that. It's really fascinating. And then also some of the restorative justice experiments in Rwanda.
Yep, exactly. Indeed. All right, I think we are at time. I want to thank all of you for coming to this conversation. Alex, for writing such an incredible, amazing book. It's been a pleasure to be in conversation with you. Please buy the book. It's amazing. And see you soon.